I think we'll start. Thank you, Ray, for agreeing to deliver this Brownbag lecture. We are very happy that Ray Finch has agreed to deliver this Brownbag talk. Ray Finch is a Eurasian military analyst for the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He has produced a number of analytical studies dealing with the Russian military and society, and is both an editor and frequent contributor to FMSO's OE Watch. Prior to this, he worked as the assistant to the director in the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at KU, where he handled administrative tasks and taught courses related to Russian culture. Ray Finch spent 20 years in the U.S. Army, first as field artillery officer, and then as a Eurasian Foreign Area officer, serving in Germany, Korea, Russia, and CONUS. He earned both his BA and Master's at KU. Upon retiring from the military in 1998, he spent a year and a half as the director of corporate security for Kroll Associates in Moscow. Thank you for being here.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words about the Russian artist Ilya Glazunov. Some of you are aware that he died this past summer. To commemorate his death, the Russian media was filled with various retrospectives of his paintings. In the past, I had used a couple of his works which dealt with I used a couple of his works in presentations which dealt with Russian trends and future prospects for the country, but I didn't know much about the artist. The more I read about his life and works, the more I became aware that he not only often portrayed the prevalent Russian zeitgeist, but that some of his works influenced the modern Kremlin narrative. My Brownbag talk this afternoon will hopefully provide a brief bio-sketch of the artist, a cursory examination of some of his most influential works, and a handful of implications regarding the current Kremlin narrative. A couple of caveats. This is a huge topic, not easily condensed into 30 minutes, so I've had to make some broad generalizations. Hopefully we can flesh out some of the details in the QA. Second, I know little or nothing about art, and I approach his works as a genuine amateur. The picture on the screen is a self-portrait of the artist completed in '99. During his career, Glazunov completed more than 3,000 works of art, so I will be showing you just the very tip of the iceberg. He was born in June 30 in Leningrad into an upper-class family. He was an only child. His father, Sergei, a sociologist and historian, was a lecturer at Leningrad State University. His mother's family had aristocratic roots. Glazunov later wrote that he received an atypical, for his time, education. While other Soviet children read books about Chapayev and sang songs about Lenin, he walked around the Hermitage, listened to Tchaikovsky, and read biographies of the Russian czars. This idyllic life changed drastically in 1941. In 1942, during the siege of Leningrad, both of his parents and almost all of his closest relatives died of starvation. With the help of his uncle Mikhail, a military doctor, the 12-year-old Ilya was evacuated from Leningrad, crossing Lake Lagoda to the Novgorod region. When the blockade was lifted, Glazunov returned to Leningrad. He later wrote, "Where should I go, a complete orphan? Great canvases calm me. I suddenly realized that I was not alone. With me is my homeland, its art, history. At that moment, I became an artist." He entered the Repin Institute of Painting. On the screen, you can see a picture of the 16-year-old artist and paintings titled Hunger and another titled Blockade, which he completed in 1956, as a memory from that time period. That could be the young Ilya behind the empty plate as one of his relatives plays the piano. Here you see the young artist. At age 17, he visited the Kiev-Pechesk Lavra monastery and wrote that he felt a calling to become a monk. One of the elders there encouraged Glazunov to instead become an artist, to fight evil in the world. Later, Glazunov would claim that this has been one of his primary motives as an artist, and many of his works reflect his, some might say, militant religious sentiments. Another point deserves mention regarding the young Glazunov. He did not buy into the pragmatic, optimistic, social realist school and was regarded as something of a dissident in official circles. His reluctance to adopt the prominent Soviet style is reflected in the painting there from 1951. In 1956, he married fellow student Nina Vinogradova-Benoit. They would go on to have 2 children, a son and a daughter. While protesting that he loved his wife, many of the sources I looked at commented that Glazunov was something of a ladies' man and was involved with numerous other women during their 30-year marriage. He once commented, "I am a sinner and confess that the only force that I could not resist is feminine beauty." While still at the Repin Institute, Glazunov won the grand prize at the International Competition of Young Artists in Prague in '56. He was given a solo show in Moscow the same year at the Central House of Art Workers, which caused something of a stir. As the New York Times described the exhibition, a scandal ensued. One work, Mourning, an atypically joyous painting, bright with impressionist colors, caused offense by showing a nude woman lolling on a bed while her lover stared thoughtfully out a window. The uproar over the work was reported in the foreign press, and at the next meeting of the Soviet Academy of Arts, Glazunov was taken to task for his, quote, poor taste. His frankness in portraying what he saw and believed was also felt in the tempest around his work titled Road to War, which he submitted as his thesis to the Academic Council of the Institute. It received a poor evaluation. It was not patriotic enough, as it showed the retreat of Soviet forces in the summer of '41. Consequently, Glazunov received an assignment as an art teacher out in the sticks, first at the Izhevsk trade school and then in Ivanovo. He also worked unloading trucks to make ends meet. In a later interview, Glazunov said that he sold this painting to the Central Museum of the Armed Forces, but that it was never exhibited and was likely burned. He would later reconstruct the painting from memory and from other sketches. In '58, Glazunov became acquainted with the poet, author of the Soviet anthem, and secretary of the Union of Writers, Sergei Mikhalkov, who, according to the artist, became his benefactor. Thanks to the efforts of Mikhalkov, Glazunov was given a one-room apartment in Moscow and began to get commissions to paint various official portraits. Glazunov would go on to paint more than one portrait for this important patron. The top portrait was painted in '56, the one below 30 years later in '88. According to some sources, during the Soviet era, Mikhalkov and his wife sometimes worked for the KGB. While I was unable to determine if Glazunov was on the KGB's payroll, he certainly had the support of a certain slice of the Soviet cultural elite. That he was allowed to travel all over begs the question as to his Soviet sponsor. Perhaps he was unwittingly used as a tool for Soviet soft power. Here are a couple photos from the '60s when among many other portraits, he traveled to Italy to paint the Italian actress Gina Lollobrigida. He said that he also painted portraits of Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher, but I couldn't find copies. When in Rome, he sharply criticized abstract art and modern trends, emphasizing the value of Christian civilization. In '65, he helped to create the All-Russian Society for the Protection of Historical and Cultural Monuments. Again, as a soft power weapon, in February '67, Glazunov left for North Vietnam as a special correspondent for the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, where he painted some 150 works about the glorious struggle of the North Vietnamese against American imperialism. That same year, he was admitted to the Union of Artists of the USSR. Glazunov soon became something of the unofficial Kremlin court painter, but the official artists union was still reluctant to back him. In May '73, he traveled to Chile to do a portrait of Chilean President Salvador Allende. The portrait didn't last long. In September, during the military coup, the rebels stormed the palace and burned it. In November, he traveled to India to paint a portrait of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and upon his return, Leonid Brezhnev. You would think that by this time Glazunov would be in the ranks of the Untouchables, but he continued to walk the line between something of a dissident artist and a Kremlin courtier. As someone not willing to paint within the social realist lines and displaying hints of Russian nationalism, he gained quite a following. In the lower photo, you can see people lined up to see his exhibit. All during his career, he would create illustrations for classical Russian literature. Here you can see a portrait of his favorite writer, and fellow resident of St. Petersburg, Fyodor Dostoevsky. I've also included a photo from his 2-month visit to the construction of the Baikal-Amur rail line, the BAM. Some claim that this was punishment for his refusal to admit the following painting, Mystery of the 20th Century, which was scheduled to open in exhibition that summer. Here's a later version of that painting, and I placed a yellow line where earlier versions reportedly stopped. Solzhenitsyn's image here, down here, there's Solzhenitsyn there, was apparently the major sticking point among the censors and art critics. While definitely a hodgepodge of 20th century images, some have suggested that Glazunov himself, as both a younger and then an older artist, is the true subject of the painting. In June 80, Glazunov was awarded the title People's Artist of the USSR. That autumn, he completed a work titled The Contribution of the Peoples of the Soviet Union to World Culture and Civilization, which became a gift to UNESCO. While he included some of the communist contributions, you got workers, Gorky, Gagarin, on the right, it's certainly not what he considered to be the major Russian achievements. Again, the ones up here, you can see Gagarin, there looks Gorky. I think that's Mayakovsky. Is that Mayakovsky there? I don't know who that is there. I think it is. And then the workers there. Though he was not all that highly regarded among the official Soviet art community, he continued to gather friends in high places. Here you see a portrait of the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. On the left is a photo from his August 83 trip to Nicaragua, where he spent 2 weeks on assignment with the Soviet paper Pravda and completed his series titled Nicaraguan Diary. He also did a portrait of Ortega. The following year, he put on an exhibition in Havana, Cuba, where he also did the portrait of Fidel, the only portrait of Fidel that he ever sat for, according to what I read. But it wasn't just because of his flattering portraits that he gained a following. He was saying something in his art which found little expression, at least among the official Soviet artist community, and which viewers wanted to see. For example, this work from '78. Many of his paintings have allegorical themes, such as, quote, the return of the prodigal son. Here you can see a young blue-jean Soviet youth is returning on bended knee to his master, who might symbolize Russian traditions, and behind whom stands a group of those who have contributed to Russian culture, people from Peter the Great to Dostoevsky. This painting caused considerable controversy when it was first exhibited. Again, you have to go back to that Soviet time frame when wearing blue jeans was something of a scandal. Or consider this work from '86 titled Farewell. Mourners surrounding the coffin of a grandmother were symbols of today's culture. You see the t-shirt with ABBA, blue jeans, a pioneer scarf. And through the autumn trees, you can see the symbols of communist achievement. The electrical pylons, a massive wall of high-rise cement apartments, a speeding train, and a political sign praising the glories of Soviet space achievements. You can't see it, it's up here. And many of his works would literally fill this entire wall. They're enormous. These are enormous canvases, and I think that's one of the secrets to his success. Or consider, oh no, I just did that one. Okay. Where am I here? Okay. Just before the opening of the Glazunov retrospective at the Manege in June '86, Glazunov's wife Nina committed suicide by throwing herself out of a window. Some sources said that Glazunov could never accept that it was a suicide, and I read a lot, there's a bunch of whatever speculation. If you know Russian, they love conspiracies. The lower portrait of his wife was completed in the '70s. The picture on the right is a commemorative piece for his wife that he completed some 8 years after her death. Nina had worked as a costume designer for many years, and I think maybe that captures some of what he was trying to say. Here's one of Glazunov's most famous works. Recall that in 1988, Russia celebrated its 1,000th anniversary of its Christian roots. Some have suggested that the trauma of his wife's suicide may have informed this piece titled Eternal Russia. I couldn't find much in the way of personal loss in this canvas. Rather, one can see that communism and its followers have been relegated to the ash heap while true Russian values march on. And if I have one of these huge, again, this fills an entire wall, and Glazunov's picture is actually back here, very tiny. This is not the resolution on this painting, but he included himself in the Eternal Russia. But let's get back to his life. As one who never fully embraced the communist ideal, Glazunov was at the right place when nationalism started to emerge and Russians began looking back to their Tsarist roots. As the New York Times put it at the time, in the late 80s, as Gorbachev's liberal policies took hold and the Soviet Union careened toward dissolution, Mr. Glazunov found himself a spokesman for resurgent Russian nationalism. His lifelong infatuation with the Tsarist past, the art and architecture of the Orthodox Church, and the mystical conception of the Holy Russia found an eager audience among audiences disillusioned with communism and distraught by Russia's loss of standing in the world. Liberals, on the other hand, regarded Glazunov as obscure, a xenophobe, and an anti-Semite, enthralled to the darkest forces in Russian history. In 1987, he was appointed rector of the All-Russian Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture, and in the bottom photo you can see Glazunov in front of the academy as it was being restored. As Glazunov would later remark, in order to show his fellow countrymen the rich and glorious Russian past, he would need to train acolytes. He continued to work with the Soviet and then Russian leadership to glean support to train classical Russian artists. His greatest legacy may be the various art institutes he helped to create. In 96, he was also chosen to help restore some of the Kremlin's buildings, as well as playing a key role in planning and construction of Christ the Savior Cathedral in downtown Moscow. I might have a picture of that later on. As the great Soviet experiment was beginning to collapse, Glazunov also shared his assessment. Besides his damning indictment of communism, many saw anti-Western and anti-Semitic messages. If communism or a pro-Western direction are not the answer, where should Russia look for guidance? Here's one of his works from '94 titled Russia Awaken, with a young man holding a Bible and a Kalashnikov, surrounded by military and religious heroes from the past. This is one of the images I have used to describe current Russian trends. I could have used this one biographical work to trace Glazunov's artistic past, as it captures many of the key events from his life and general beliefs. Idyllic past as a child, the starvation, loss of family, his own young family, struggle against communism, dislike of the West, etc. It's also vague enough to be open to many different interpretations. Like over here, I'm not sure what this is. You've got his head, and it looks like something like a larva or something coming out in water. I'm not sure what exactly it means. That's his son and daughter. You can see that's him with Nina early on. There they are, family. There you see that same child behind the empty plate, one of his favorite images. And then over here you can see what he doesn't like. This may be the path to nowhere, Western materialism, capitalism, whatever you want to call it. With the change of administrations pending in the Kremlin and the country beginning to move in a less westerly direction, Glazunov's popularity continued to grow. As I mentioned, besides his artwork, he was involved in a number of projects to restore various architectural sites and construct new art academies. Here's a photo of one of the restored Kremlin halls that he was involved with. Glazunov also became a frequent guest on various TV shows dealing with Russian culture. If you've ever watched Kultura, you've seen Glazunov, I'm sure. This particular work has become somewhat iconic for those who have created the current Kremlin narrative about what occurred in Russia during the 1990s. Perhaps most prophetic is the image of Glazunov himself with the message around his neck, "Where are you, true sons of Russia?" For those who don't know Russian, let me translate a couple of the other signs in the painting. There's Glazunov over here, and it says, "Где вы, Россия, верни сини?" And over here it says, help Russian refugees even inside Russia. Down here it says, we're selling Russian children for, you name, for whatever purpose you want, transplantations. There's all sorts, you have to look at this closely, but there's all sorts of little not so subtle messages here saying that Russia definitely went in the wrong direction during the 1990s, according to Mr. Glazunov. Shortly after this painting was exhibited, Glazunov was labeled as the most outstanding artist of the 20th century, according to a poll of the All-Russian Public Opinion Research Center. His message resonated with many Russians, and here are a couple photos from 2000 where his popularity is on display. In the lower photo, Glazunov is seen elaborating, you can see him there, elaborating on his various work, and you get to see just the size of these. There's Eternal Russia there. I mean, it's a huge canvas, enormous. Glazunov was well known and celebrated within conservative circles. He claims to be a member of the original Rodina Club, established in the 1960s, which was then forbidden but came back during the 90s. Here are a couple of photos with some of his ideological colleagues. He had originally met Jean-Marie Le Pen back in '68 in France when he visited Paris. From my cursory review of Glazunov's life, he tended to become more conservative, perhaps even reactionary, as he grew older. He explained his life, philosophy, and view of art in his memoir, Russia Crucified, which was published in 2005. There he is holding a copy of it. And thank you, Ilham. He's not here, but he actually got a copy of the first book of this, and let me read it. I haven't read the whole thing, but I want to read just a couple quotes from the preface. And this is from Russia Crucified. In the days of popular apathy and despair, in the days of the collapse and transformation of our country into a colonial appendage of America and Europe, when the Russians should become slaves of new masters who came to the place prepared by the communists who did not know mercy, forgetting about their former imperial great power, I would like to inspire faith in genuine knowledge of Russian history and those from whom it was taken. Here's another quote. The history of the Russian tribe was mostly written by its enemies. I am a small particle of the Russian nation, and I am proud that for over 30 years of my creative career, I have served God, Russia, and my conscience. Here are a couple of photos of Glazunov and his new chief patron. You can see his new significant other. Her name is Inessa Orlova, in the one where he is meeting Putin and the King of Spain. I was unable to determine whether they were ever officially married. I don't know if they were ever married or not. It's interesting that I was unable to locate a single picture or portrait by Glazunov of Vladimir Putin. Was this a sign of respect and intimidation? You may recall an incident which occurred in June 2009 when Putin visited Glazunov's gallery and pointed out that he thought the sword displayed in the picture of Prince Oleg and Igor, the one there on your left, was too small, was too short, and that it would only be good for cutting sausage. Glazunov agreed that the picture needed correcting and praised the sharp eye of the leader. I was unable to find a copy of the original. I think it's the one there on the left. But here are a couple of Russian bloggers who commented on the incident. You can see they made fun of it. And I have a short newscast here. I'd like to show, oops, if I can show you this short newscast from that incident. And let's see if I get the technology to work here. There we go. Let me make full screen here.
Письмоварение из общества теперь будет носить имя Ильи Глазунова. И об этом художнику сегодня лично сообщил Владимир Путин. Он посетил галерею мастера в Москве. И поздравил его.
There he is visiting one of Glazunov's galleries.
79 лет в галерее выставлено более 700 работ. Премьеру успел увидеть лишь некоторые.
А здесь знаменитые русские святые. Владимир Святой, Сергий Радонежский, Борис Глеб.
Борис Глеб, конечно, святые, понятно. Но надо бороться за себя, за страну. Они как-то все это отдали мне.
The sword's too short. If you want to be a real, you got to have a big sword.
Обсудили премьеру художник и еще одну картину мастера. На ней изображена он былинный богатырь, Владимир Путин усомнился в реалистичности меча героя. По мнению главы правительства, он должен быть длиннее.
Да.
Да, он должен был, наверное, быть...
Как врачи.
Да. Вот до сюда. Там. Уже хорошо. Я тут не
Ага.
Вы абсолютно правы. Я обычно не знаю. Да.
All right, you get the point of what he was saying there. Let's see. Where do I go to? Here we go. I actually have another little video too. Let's see where. Here's another photo of Glazunov and Putin. This time during the president's visit to Glazunov's new Museum of the Estates, Soslovia. While I haven't visited this museum, it purportedly portrays how well-functioning Tsarist Russia was when the country was separated into various classes. And I actually have a short video, but maybe I'll wait till after the QA to show it. The other photo is from Glazunov's burial service. While not quite a state funeral, it was covered widely in the Russian media. His grave is in the Novodevichy Cemetery, and as I mentioned, there were numerous media reports after his death talking about his contributions. And if we have time after the QA, there's a little 4-minute video that captures a lot of it, and you'll get to see it. But let me conclude with a handful of implications derived from his life and work. First, I think that Glazunov was a solid artist who left his country a rich legacy. As I mentioned up front, I'm not an art expert, but I found many of his works to be both aesthetically pleasing and thought-provoking. Granted, his political or moral message is sometimes overwhelming, but there's no doubt that he was capable of portraying the world in interesting ways. As Glazunov himself put it, the principles of true art is not to portray, but to evoke. Moreover, Glazunov helped to establish artistic institutions which train classical Russian artists. His own artwork will likely fade in popularity, but his legacy will live on in the art schools he helped to create. There is no question that Glazunov idealized the Russian past, particularly the time before communism, or BC. After the failure of communism, instead of looking to the future or among foreign nations for answers on how to run the country, his art suggests that Russia should return to its Tsarist past. And a key element in the Tsarist past is the central role of the Orthodox faith. From my perspective, it appears that instead of buying into the social realist belief of the Soviet period, Glazunov developed an equally mendacious model which might be labeled Tsarist realism, where life is wonderful under the Tsar. Many today in Russia hearken back to the glory days of the Soviet Union. Much of Glazunov's artwork is a strong indictment against this nostalgia, portraying the violence, brutality, and destruction of the communist experiment in Russia. In this painting, you can see they've transformed the church into a meat locker, while in the distance you can see the misguided believers pushing a truck in the snow. Here's another huge Glazunov work where the Bolshevik destruction of Russian Orthodox tradition is on full display. And yet another, on a similar theme, dispossession of the kulaks. While there are many Russians today who would argue with Glazunov regarding the country's Soviet legacy, these conservatives would likely agree with him that not only were the 1990s a decade of humiliation and domestic collapse, but the West, in particular the United States, was responsible for Russia's reduced status. The work titled The Market of Our Democracy, discussed earlier, reflects these sentiments. Here are a couple of additional works which illustrate this belief. If you look carefully at the painting on the lower left, you can see the old woman holding a cup of soup and a Snickers bar, while the old man has a bottle of something in his pocket. All the while, the rundown church on the horizon now flies the Russian flag. The painting on the lower right shows how strange immigrants have invaded Europe, or Venice, with a resident walking away in anguish. Note what appears to be an American flag in the lower left. Down here you can see just the symbols of the American flag there. Finally, if the Western model is corrupt and communism an abject failure, where should Russia look for a model for good governance and a healthy society? Glazunov appears to be directing the Kremlin leadership toward Russia's distant past, particularly Russian society under the Tsarist regime and the Orthodox faith. There's a strong nationalist element in much of his art. To conclude, Glazunov was a talented artist who lost most of his family in a god-awful war. He then figured out how to play and succeed at the Soviet game by pleasing his bosses and not-so-subtle appeals to Russian nationalism and memories of greatness. He may have been used by the Kremlin as a soft power tool. He was not a party hack, but rather had the courage, or maybe cleverness, talent, and endurance to portray what he saw and thought. He did much, both to restore Russian classical art and a positive perspective on the country's Tsarist and Orthodox traditions. I suggest that some of his later art has helped to shape the current Kremlin narrative. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. That's one of the more intriguing works he's got, Christ, Antichrist. Questions?